The dust settled on the outskirts of Cottonwood Springs as another dry summer day came to its conclusion. The sun cast long shadows across the parched landscape, painting the sandstone cliffs in hues of amber and gold. Thomas Blackwood sat on the porch of his modest ranch house, weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee gone cold. At 53, his face was a roadmap of hardship, each line and crease telling stories of survival in a land that took more than it gave. His eyes, still sharp beneath the brim of his worn Stetson, scanned the horizon with the vigilance of a man who'd seen too much bloodshed to ever truly rest. The ranch wasn't much, 100 acres, some cattle, and a reputation for fair dealing. But it was his, built from nothing after returning from the war with nothing but nightmares and determination. I'd love to ask you to subscribe to our channel right now if you're enjoying this story so far. From which city are you watching today? The widow Clara Bennett had arrived in Cottonwood Springs 3 months prior, taking over the general store after her husband's passing back east. At 38, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had known grief intimately, but refused to be defined by it. Her auburn hair was always neatly pinned, her clothing modest but well-kept, and her manner reserved yet kind. The townsfolk had welcomed her with the cautious acceptance typical of frontier communities, ready to embrace her if she proved her worth, equally ready to turn away should she falter. Thomas had only spoken to her briefly during his monthly trips into town for supplies, but there was something in her steadfast composure that reminded him of a strength he recognized, the kind forged in fire. Sheriff James Holbrook was one of the few men Thomas considered a friend, though neither would ever use such a sentimental term. They'd fought together during the war, survived the same battles, and carried the same ghosts. Now Holbrook maintained what passed for law in Cottonwood Springs, with a pragmatic approach that favored justice over strict adherence to rules written by men who'd never set foot west of the Mississippi. His office door stood open most days, a Winchester rifle within reach, and a coffee pot perpetually on the stove. When trouble brewed, as it inevitably did in a territory where fortunes could change with a deck of cards or the discovery of silver, Holbrook was known to find solutions that kept the peace without necessarily filling his jail cells. The Apache had appeared on Thomas's land a week earlier, half dead from a gunshot wound and severe dehydration. He called himself Nakohi, the wanderer in the white man's tongue, though Thomas suspected this wasn't his true name. Standing just over 6 feet tall, with the lean, hard muscle of a man who lived by hunting and fighting, Nakohi had initially said little beyond asking for water and a place to recover. Thomas had hesitated only briefly before offering both. The war had taught him that a man's tribe or color meant little when measured against his character, and something in the Apache's direct gaze spoke of honor. Besides, Thomas wasn't one to deny aid to anyone who needed it, regardless of what the residents of Cottonwood Springs might think about harboring an Apache. The trouble began with the arrival of Jeremiah Blackwell and his men. Not kin to Thomas, despite the similar surname, Jeremiah represented the Southwestern Pacific Railroad, or so he claimed. His real employer was anyone willing to pay for his particular skills, which involved acquiring land by any means necessary. With 3 hired guns flanking him, men with cold eyes and quick hands, Blackwell had appeared at Thomas's gate with an offer to buy the ranch at half its value. When Thomas refused, the threats began, veiled at first, then increasingly explicit. Cottonwood Springs was about to prosper, Blackwell explained, once the railroad came through. Those who cooperated would benefit. Those who didn't would find themselves swept aside, one way or another. What Blackwell didn't know, couldn't know, was that Thomas had faced far worse than the threats of land grabbers. 20 years earlier, he'd watched as Comanche raiders burned his first homestead in Texas, taking his young wife Sarah and their infant son. He'd spent 3 years tracking them before finally accepting they were gone forever. That loss had hollowed him out, replaced everything soft inside with grit and steel. Now, with most of his life behind him, Thomas had little left to lose, and no patience for men like Blackwell, who mistook decency for weakness. As the land grabber and his men rode away, Thomas had simply returned to mending his fences, though his mind was already calculating what would come next. He knew enough about men like Blackwell to understand this was just the opening move in a deadly game. The unexpected alliance began the following evening, when Nakoe, his wound healing but still moving with caution, joined Thomas by the fire. In halting but clear English, the Apache explained what had brought him to Thomas's land. Blackwell's men had attacked his small band, remnants of a once proud people, now struggling to survive in the ever-shrinking territories left to them. They'd been accused of stealing cattle, though they'd done no such thing. When they protested their innocence, guns were drawn. Nakoe had escaped with a bullet in his side. The fate of the others remained unknown. As Thomas listened, he recognized the familiar pattern. False accusations used to justify violence, creating pretexts for taking what wasn't freely given. The railroad wanted a clear path through these lands, and anyone, white settler or Apache, who stood in the way became an obstacle to be removed. Clara Bennett's involvement came as a surprise to Thomas. She arrived at his ranch unannounced, driving a small wagon loaded with supplies from her store. Her normally composed features were tight with worry as she explained what she'd overheard. Blackwell boasting drunkenly in her store about how he'd soon own half the valley, including Thomas's ranch. More troublingly, he'd mentioned bringing in more men from Tucson, specialists who knew how to handle stubborn cases. Thomas had tried to dismiss her concerns, unwilling to draw a woman into what was clearly becoming a dangerous situation. Clara had fixed him with a stern gaze that brooked no argument. Her husband, she revealed, hadn't died from illness as everyone believed. He'd been murdered by men working for a railroad in Pennsylvania when he refused to sell their family business. She hadn't come west merely to escape painful memories. She'd come seeking a fresh start in a place where she might find some measure of justice. Sheriff Holbrook arrived as they were talking, his expression grim. 2 bodies had been found in Devil's Canyon, Apache by their dress, both shot in the back. Though he couldn't prove Blackwell's involvement, the timing was too convenient to ignore. More concerning were the rumors filtering in from neighboring communities. Blackwell's employer wasn't just interested in a railroad path. They were after something more valuable. Geological surveys had suggested significant silver deposits in the hills surrounding Cottonwood Springs. The railroad was merely a convenient excuse to seize land that might soon yield far greater riches. As the 4 of them, rancher, widow, lawman, and Apache, sat around Thomas's kitchen table, an unlikely alliance took shape. Each had suffered at the hands of men who viewed lives as expendable in the pursuit of wealth. Each had reason to stand against what was coming, and each possessed skills the others would need in the days ahead. Nakoe moved like a shadow through the darkness, his moccasined feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth. 3 days of careful scouting had revealed Blackwell's camp, hidden in a box canyon 2 miles from town. 14 men in total, more than they'd anticipated, with repeating rifles and plenty of ammunition. Too many for a direct confrontation, even with Holbrook's badge lending some semblance of authority. They would need strategy over force, cunning over confrontation. The Apache slipped back toward Thomas's ranch, carrying information that would shape their plan. As he approached, he spotted Clara's wagon hidden behind the barn. She had insisted on being part of whatever they decided, her determination a match for any of them. Inside, gathered around a map of the territory spread across the table, the unlikely conspirators awaited his report. The first step was clear. They needed to divide Blackwell's force, reduce the odds before making their move. Clara's role was perhaps the most dangerous, yet she insisted on playing it. As the new owner of the general store, she had legitimate reason to visit the camp, bringing supplies and taking orders for future deliveries. While there, she would observe, counting men, noting weapons, identifying the leaders. She would also carry whiskey, generously discounted as a welcome gift to new customers. Whiskey that Thomas had carefully doctored with herbs that would ensure deep sleep for those who partook. Holbrook, meanwhile, would create a distraction miles away, spreading rumors of Apache raids near the southern pass, drawing off as many of Blackwell's men as possible. Thomas and Nakohe would handle what remained, though neither spoke openly about what that might entail. Some things were better left unspoken in the presence of a lady, though Clara's tight-lipped nod suggested she understood the full measure of what they planned. The day of reckoning dawned clear and hot, the kind of heat that made men irritable and careless. Clara set out early, her wagon loaded with goods, her heart hammering beneath the calm exterior she fought to maintain. Thomas watched her go with a newfound respect and a concern that surprised him with its intensity. When had this woman's welfare become so important to him? Beside him, Nakohe prepared for his part, painting his face with the traditional markings of his people. This was no longer just about land or threats. For the Apache, it was about honoring his fallen brothers, ensuring their deaths were not meaningless. As they worked in companionable silence, Thomas reflected on how fate had drawn them together, enemies by heritage, allies by choice. The irony might have amused him under different circumstances. Sheriff Holbrook played his part to perfection, riding into settlements south of Cottonwood Springs with urgent warnings of Apache activity. He pointed to distant smoke signals that he himself had set that morning, spinning tales convincing enough to send 5 of Blackwell's men galloping southward to investigate. By midday, Clara had returned from the camp, pale but composed. 8 men remained, she reported, including Blackwell. 6 had eagerly accepted her whiskey. 2 abstained, Blackwell himself and his right-hand man, a scar-faced killer known only as Wilson. The doctored whiskey would take effect after nightfall, leaving only 2 adversaries fully alert. The odds were shifting in their favor, though Thomas cautioned against overconfidence. Men like Blackwell didn't achieve their positions by being easily outmaneuvered. As dusk settled over the land, Thomas and Nakohe approached the canyon on foot, leading their horses quietly through the scrubland. The first stars were appearing in the deepening blue sky, and night birds called to one another in the gathering darkness. Neither man spoke. They'd discussed the plan thoroughly and now moved with the silent understanding of warriors who recognized what lay ahead. Thomas carried his old army Colt, well-maintained and deadly accurate in his experienced hand. Nakoe had his hunting knife and a Winchester rifle, borrowed from Thomas's collection. The Apache moved ahead, his night vision and tracking skills guiding them to the camp's perimeter without alerting the sentries, who, as Clara had predicted, were already showing signs of the whiskey's effects, slumping at their posts. The confrontation, when it came, was swift and decisive. Thomas took Wilson as he emerged from Blackwell's tent, dropping him with a single shot before he could clear his holster. The sound echoed through the canyon, but the drugged men barely stirred in their bedrolls. Blackwell, however, was instantly alert, barricading himself in his tent and firing wildly through the canvas. Nako circled behind, while Thomas provided distraction, cutting through the back of the tent and disarming Blackwell with a fluid movement that spoke of years spent in life-or-death struggles. When Thomas entered moments later, he found the land grabber pinned to the ground, the Apache's knee firmly in the small of his back. What followed wasn't an execution. Thomas had seen enough killing in his life, but rather justice, frontier style. Blackwell was tied to his horse, documentation of his illegal activities secured from his saddlebags, and a strongly worded letter for his employers attached to his jacket. The message was clear. Cottonwood Springs and its people, all its people, were not for sale. Dawn was breaking as they returned to town, leading Blackwell's horse with its humiliated cargo. Sheriff Holbrook met them at the jailhouse, took custody of the prisoner and the evidence, and promised a telegraph to the territorial governor would be his first order of business. Thomas felt a weight lifting as they parted ways, though he knew challenges still lay ahead. The railroad wouldn't abandon its plans easily, but they'd sent a clear message about the cost of pursuing them. As he and Nakohe rode toward his ranch, an unexpected sight greeted them. Clara Bennett, waiting on his porch, coffee brewing on the stove inside. She'd been watching for their return, she admitted, with a directness that matched his own. The three of them sat in companionable silence as the sun climbed higher, each contemplating the unlikely bond forged in the crucible of shared danger. The days that followed brought changes to Cottonwood Springs. Word spread quickly of Blackwell's defeat and the alliance that had accomplished it. The territorial governor, facing pressure from several influential ranchers who'd heard of the attempted land grab, launched an investigation into the railroad's practices. Blackwell and his remaining men were escorted from the territory by a contingent of cavalry, their threats rendered empty by the documents Thomas had secured. More significantly, the town's attitude toward Nakoe, and by extension, the few Apache who occasionally came to trade, underwent a subtle shift. Not acceptance, not quite yet, but a grudging acknowledgement that perhaps not all indigenous people were the bloodthirsty savages of legend. For Clara Bennett, the confrontation with Blackwell had provided something she'd sought since her husband's murder. Not vengeance, exactly, but a sense that justice was still possible in a world that often seemed to reward the violent and unscrupulous. The general store prospered under her careful management, becoming a gathering place for townsfolk and travelers alike. She maintained her dignified reserve in public, but those closest to her, a circle that now included Thomas and, surprisingly, Nakoe, saw glimpses of the warm, occasionally mischievous woman beneath. Thomas found himself inventing reasons to visit town more frequently, though he tried to convince himself it was simply to check on how things were progressing with the governor's investigation. The most profound change, however, was in the relationship between Thomas and Nakohe. What had begun as reluctant shelter, offered to an injured stranger, evolve into mutual respect. Then, something approaching friendship. The Apache spent increasing time at Thomas's ranch, initially helping with repairs and cattle management, later sharing stories and skills. Thomas learned tracking methods that had been passed down through generations of Nkohe's people. In return, he taught the Apache techniques for breaking horses he'd developed during his years in Texas. When Nkohe's wound had fully healed and the immediate danger had passed, Thomas had expected him to leave, to return to whatever remained of his band or seek new territories less encroached upon by white settlement. Instead, the Apache had simply continued their established routine, and Thomas found he welcomed the company. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset paint the western sky in spectacular color, Nkohe spoke of his childhood, the first time he'd shared anything so personal. He described a life that was harsh but rich in tradition and meaning, filled with teachings that emphasized harmony with the natural world and respect for all living things. His people had once controlled vast territories, moving with the seasons to hunt and gather. Their connection to the land, spiritual, as well as practical. Now they were confined to reservations or forced to live as fugitives, their way of life systematically destroyed by policies crafted thousands of miles away by men who would never set foot on these lands. Thomas listened silently, recognizing the grief underlying the Apache's matter-of-fact narrative, the same grief he'd carried since losing Sarah and their son. Clara's integration into their unlikely friendship happened gradually, beginning with her regular deliveries of supplies that somehow always included freshly baked bread or preserved fruits, items Thomas suspected weren't on his original order list. Her visits grew longer, often extending to sharing the evening meal. One particularly memorable night, Nkohe had prepared a traditional Apache dish of venison and wild herbs that had them all reaching for water to cool their burning mouths, followed by helpless laughter at their collective discomfort. Thomas couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed so freely, the sound rusty but genuine. As spring turned to summer, he found himself watching Clara with increasing awareness, noting the graceful movement of her hands as she poured coffee, the way sunlight caught in her hair, the quiet strength that had drawn him from the beginning. The incident that cemented their bond occurred unexpectedly during what should have been a routine cattle drive to the railhead at Silver Junction. Thomas, Nkohe, and two hired hands were moving a small herd when a sudden thunderstorm spooked the cattle, triggering a stampede toward a steep ravine. In the chaos that followed, Thomas's horse stumbled, throwing him directly into the path of the panicked animals. What happened next became the stuff of local legend. Nkohe riding into the stampeding herd without hesitation, reaching down to haul Thomas onto his horse in a display of strength and horsemanship that defied belief. They'd lost 8 cattle to the ravine, but saved the majority of the herd, and more importantly, Thomas's life. When they finally returned to Cottonwood Springs, Clara had been waiting anxiously, having heard garbled reports of disaster. The sight of her usually composed face, openly showing relief when they rode in, had caused something to shift in Thomas's carefully guarded heart. It was a warm June evening when Clara visited the ranch alone, bringing news that would affect all of them. The territorial governor had responded to the petitions regarding land rights in the Cottonwood Springs area. New regulations would protect established settlers, including Thomas, from forced buyouts, and a small reservation was being established 30 miles to the northwest for the remaining Apache bands in the region. It wasn't perfect, The reservation lands were not the ancestral territories Nakohe's people had once called home, but it offered some measure of security and self-governance. More personally, Clara revealed that she had received an offer to sell the general store at a handsome profit. She was considering it, she explained, her eyes not quite meeting Thomas's, unless she had reason to stay in Cottonwood Springs. The implications of her statement hung in the air between them, creating a tension Thomas hadn't experienced since his courting days decades earlier. Nakohe, displaying the tactful awareness that continually surprised Thomas, murmured something about checking the western fence line and disappeared into the gathering dusk. Left alone on the porch, Thomas and Clara sat in silence as fireflies began to emerge, their tiny lights punctuating the darkness. Thomas wasn't a man given to flowery words or grand declarations. Instead, he spoke plainly about the life he could offer. Not luxurious, but stable, with room for growth and change. He spoke of his past, including the pain he'd carried for so long, and how her presence had somehow eased that burden. When he finished, Clara's hand found his, her fingers intertwining with the work-roughened digits that had known too much hardship and too little tenderness. Their wedding, held in late summer, was a simple affair by Eastern standards, but drew attendance from throughout the territory. Sheriff Holbrook stood as Thomas's best man, resplendent in a rarely worn formal jacket that strained slightly at the shoulders. Clara was attended by the wife of the town doctor, wearing a blue dress ordered specially from St. Louis for the occasion. Most remarkable to the townsfolk was the presence of Nakohe, standing proudly beside Thomas, dressed in a unique combination of Apache ceremonial attire and frontier formal wear. There were whispers, of course, there always were in small communities. But the couple and their unusual friend paid them no mind. They had faced far worse than gossip together and emerged stronger for it. The new reservation became home to 17 Apache families by year's end, including distant cousins of Nakohe, who had been hiding in the mountains for years. Though he maintained his dwelling at Thomas's ranch, Nakohe spent increasing time with his people, helping them adapt to the confined space while preserving essential traditions. Thomas and Clara visited regularly, bringing supplies and medical aid when needed. Their presence was initially met with suspicion by many of the Apache, but Nakohe's influence gradually opened doors, creating small bridges between cultures that had been locked in conflict for generations. It wasn't peace, not exactly. Too much blood had been spilled on both sides for that, but it was a beginning, a tentative step toward understanding. As winter settled over Cottonwood Springs, bringing short days and long, cold nights, the three friends often gathered around the fireplace in what was now Thomas and Clara's home. Sometimes they spoke of the future, Clara's plans for expanding the ranch's operations to include breeding horses, Thomas's ideas for improving the main house, Nakohe's efforts to establish a council among the reservation Apache that could negotiate effectively with territorial authorities. Other evenings passed in comfortable silence, each lost in private thoughts, yet connected by bonds forged in adversity and strengthened by choice. On one such night, as snow fell softly outside and firelight cast dancing shadows across the walls, Clara asked Nakohe about his true name, the one he had not shared when they first met. The Apache was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as if seeking guidance from ancestral spirits. Then, with the hint of a smile softening his weathered features, he explained that names held power in his culture and were not given lightly to outsiders. But they were no longer outsiders, he continued. They had become something his people had a specific word. His true name, he revealed, meant "he who bridges worlds," given by a grandmother who claimed to see futures in her dreams. Thomas and Clara exchanged glances, struck by the appropriateness of the name and touched by the trust its sharing represented. As the fire crackled and night deepened around the ranch house, the three unlikely friends raised cups of coffee in a silent toast to bridges built and worlds connected in the vast, unforgiving, yet oddly beautiful landscape of the American frontier. As dawn broke over Cottonwood Springs the following morning, Thomas stood on his porch, watching the sun illuminate a world transformed by snow. Clara joined him, slipping her hand into his with the easy familiarity of true partnership. In the distance, Nakoe approached on horseback, returning from an overnight stay at the reservation. Thomas reflected on the strange, winding trail that had brought them all together. A path marked by loss and hardship, yes, but ultimately leading to this moment of quiet contentment. The frontier remained a harsh place, where survival was never guaranteed and change was the only constant. But in finding each other, they had each found something worth protecting, a fellowship that transcended the divisions of their time and offered hope for what might yet be possible in this wild, unfinished land. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.